All right. Well, thank you guys for coming to Public Access today. I'm excited to sit down with Joe. You're going to be talking to me because I really just like to talk about history on TV. If I was allowed to only talk about history, I would. It's kind of just easy to talk about nothing and just kind of get lost in how interesting it is. And for New Mexicans, we have a lot of history to talk about, and your specialty specifically is American violence in the Southwest as well. And you I believe, did your when you're getting your doctorate. That's what you did your work on. And I think that's really good for our viewers here. And I just kind of wanted to learn more myself if I'm going to keep talking about history here. So I was really just kind of hoping I could bring you on today to make myself a little bit smarter, because as I keep talking about history, I want to make sure I'm not stumbling over myself and not knowing what I'm talking about. So you have a channel called the Cynical Historian, where you educate over 250,000 followers on a regular basis about really interesting aspects of history. I mean, you cover everything. You like to debunk what other people think. You like to cover things that aren't talked about a lot. You like to go over things multiple times, giving different perspectives. You really focus on just the perspective of history and how it relates to people. And that's what I really like about your channel and the way you do it. You're also a local professor here at UNM. So you educate a lot of people about history. Today we ask that you educate our viewers. Tell me, why did you start studying history? What's the most interesting thing about it for you?
It was, so I started doing history because I was kind of forced into it.
Forced into history?
Yeah, my father's a historian, and he used to run local museums in Nevada, and I had to do it a lot, and I started off as an architecture major, and pretty much I didn't fail out of it, but I didn't make it.
So you went towards history because you had a father that was kind of putting that on you a bit.
Yeah.
And why is it then that history kind of caught you, though, that you're like, I do want to study this for my life? There's something that I imagine really speaks to you to say that this is why I focus entirely my life on history.
Oh, history is the story of us, right? And that storytelling element, it imparts a creative element, but also gives it importance. It's our story, and I want to tell it.
I think that's kind of what history always seems to be about, is in looking at people from before. You kind of learn a little bit about yourself. I'm having this conversation kind of at a weird time, just because I recently did a genealogy on my own family. So I discovered that a lot of my family came to New Mexico in the early 15 and 1600s as Spanish colonizers. And to have the records of your own family, knowing where you come from, and to see that part of colonization, it's kind of surreal to put yourself in that history. You start to realize that the things you read about are very connected to the land you live on, to your own family history. And in order to kind of understand how I feel about that, I think the best thing for me to do is kind of understand how it affects us today and where we're going forward. So these interviews I kind of like to do with around one question, and to kind of look at how we can talk about that one question in a variety of ways. And the question I decided I wanted to ask you today was, is colonialism over? Because looking at my family's history, it was really interesting to see these colonists coming over the eras and meeting different people, and the Catholic Church keeping these records of what cities they were living in, where they were going to. And I don't know all of the story of what their lives were like, but it gives me an idea of what their colonization was like. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with a lot of people who are against colonization here on this channel. And it's kind of interesting for me because I don't know if the colonization is over. And to see Albuquerque's growth with its industry growing, is this part of colonization? Well, how do I actually kind of take this history and start applying it going forward? I'd like to know your opinion on something like that.
So first of all, of course, it's going to revolve around the definition of colonialism.
Sure, let's start there, yeah.
There's a core concept that's kind of controversial in the history profession, but has been gaining a lot of traction, called settler colonialism. It's the idea that that settlement is a form of colonization, and something that I studied specifically within New Mexican history is how settler colonialism kind of had two different phases, kind of a double colonization. After 1848, of course, becomes the American period, but that's on top of Spanish and Mexican rule before it. So you had this layered sovereignty that had to be negotiated. And that period, from my period of study is 1848 to 1919, and the violence therein is all related to what I call incorporation. Historian Richard Maxwell Brown called all the violence basically from the 1850s onward in the West the Western Civil War of incorporation. And so the idea is that these Western territories and states had to be incorporated into the national body politic. And so that could be considered a form of colonialism right there. But obviously that period ends. But also with New Mexico, there's historians who have argued that New Mexico has been colonized as an economic territory by the East, and then eventually by California and Texas.
And what does that colonization look like? How do you see that in the world that we live in today?
So that would be the economic dependence. For instance, here in Albuquerque, we had the boom from World War II, where a lot of it revolved around making the bomb. That was all organized by California universities. UNM didn't have much to do with it, and it was very California-centric. Los Alamos, for instance, was run by UC Berkeley until 2007, and actually had like a joint running it for another few years after that. So that's kind of economic colonization.
So in a way, you can actually look at when the United States is supporting Albuquerque, Santa Fe, this region, in different industries. We have an Amazon plant that you can see on the horizon that looms over us.
Oh, yeah.
There's a large Intel plant in Rio Rancho area, and we now celebrate a lot of film that's coming here and investing into that space. A lot of those are outside investments. Would you say that kind of looking at that form of business within America is in a way colonialism? Is that my understanding that kind of right? Or
that's the argument.
That's how do you feel about that argument then yourself? Is it convincing, or is there something that's a little too easy about that?
It's very easy to throw around the word colony and just make it try to fit newer things, but here I don't know if that really works, but it's not my area.
Fair enough. That's not exactly where we study that. And maybe where I think it's interesting to me for that reason, maybe not so much Albuquerque, but is Albuquerque has a lot of Native American reservations on it. And that way, we also look a lot in how American business interacts with these parts of our country, and specifically parts of New Mexico. Currently playing on public access right now is an interview we did with a uranium activist who is championing against a company that's doing ISL mining in Navajo Nation. To me, that definitely seems like some form of colonization when you start to have the way that these wars set up the Native American communities, the very struggles that actually defined now our legal interactions. They're now being used to use business against the very communities that the wars were used against. So maybe that does feel a little bit like a continuation of colonialism there.
Well, certainly with Navajo Nation and uranium mining, there's a long history there because in the 1950s there was a big uranium speculation boom. There were literally people just spanning out across the desert and with Geiger counters and just shoving them into rocks and finding new deposits and all that. It was quite a wild time, and kind of the last mineral rush in the West. And if we think of the gold rush as a form of colonization, then why not that? So yeah, you could definitely see that as similar. The one thing that you have to consider when talking about tribes and tribal lands as colonies is that while they are reserved lands, that's why it's called reservation, you also have to consider the fact that they are considered independent and sovereign nations. The Supreme Court called them in 1832 domestic dependent nations. That's still the language that is used.
Is that used anywhere else? I don't know if I've heard that to describe any other.
Yeah, that's actually in the charter for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But
that's really interesting.
Yeah, there's a long history.
Domestic dependent nation. I haven't heard that before. I like
that.
that.
That was in a Supreme Court ruling in 1832. It was Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, I believe.
Wow. And that certainly feels like, I imagine, especially if you're part of the Native American community, that would feel like the continuation of colonialization is affecting you in your community.
But they also you have to consider that they are considered their own sovereign entities. And so when negotiating such things as mineral rights and that, it's not forced upon them, instead it is negotiated with the tribe and however that tribe is organized. Sometimes you have free stakeholders, sometimes you have collective rights. It all depends on that specific tribe.
That is kind of the interesting thing about it, is it's a case-by-case basis, whatever you're looking at. None of the nations for the indigenous people around our country seem to have the same problems, have the same motives, have the same approaches to their problems. It seems to be a very vast issue. When I'm looking at New Mexico history, it's really interesting to me looking at Navajo Nation specifically. One of your videos I was watching, you put up a map of the southwest region before the European arrival, and it had the different showing of the Native American groups of where they were kind of interacting. The
I believe
loose
that's
borders.
the USGS map from 1980 something.
This is why you do what you do. You can just pull that back out of your head. Maybe I can have my editor put that map up too. What I think is really interesting is
Public domain.
Yeah, if you look at that map, what's really interesting to me is when you look at the Navajo Nation, it stretches pretty far into Colorado, going west, going east, especially towards Mexico and Texas. But when you look at the core, what's called for the Dene culture, the Four Sacred Mountains, where the majority of that society exists. When you look at now what Navajo Nation exists today, even the way it bends around the Zuni people, it's funny to me because those borders haven't really changed a whole lot in that regard. The core of Navajo Nation seems to be intact. It's a lot of Native Americans were actually displaced from their homes.
Well, it should be noted that that map is created by the USGS, and to kind of have a representation of where tribes were once they were contacted by Americans. For instance, there's a region called the Dinétah that that a lot of Navajos were on, and they moved steadily westward, especially after the Pueblo Revolt. So that map makes it seem like they're static borders and all that, and that's just not
That's
true.
definitely not how the region worked in that time. So that might be a very good thing to remember, is that borders weren't as static in the pre-Columbian area of this region.
Well, the entire idea of borders, especially in the Southwest, is a fairly European thing.
Right. So that kind of makes sense, and that's why I find it interesting when now we're kind of looking at the descendants of the Native American peoples and the struggles they have with the current American government. And when you look at the borders of Navajo Nation, the Four Sacred Mountains still seem to be at the center of their people, which is interesting. It doesn't seem, if it was a state, actually, it would be bigger than 2 of the other U.S. states. So it's a pretty sizable land that's taken out of America. That when you look at an American map, if you saw that chunk actually taken out, you would notice that there's a little piece missing in the middle there. So if I'm looking to establish if a people are actually conquered or not, that doesn't actually look like that. It looks like America went around Navajo Nation in a really practical way. That these societies, despite we kind of talk about colonization and the inclusion of them, I think you started off talking about the what is it, the Civil War of
The
incorporation?
The Western Civil War of Incorporation.
Right, and you're thinking about that kind of concept. It feels very much like these independent cultures and languages are actually still thriving very much now in the center of the American empire.
Well, Navajos have a fairly unique history on that, and that's why their reservation is the largest. They were mostly known for raiding prior to the 1860s, but when the California column came through and kicked the Confederates out, the leader of it was a guy named Carleton, and he had a long history of fighting Indians, particularly Paiutes, and he wanted to apply that to end Navajo raiding on Hispanic settlements. So he gathered them up, sent them to Bosque Redondo, where he had also already sent Kit Carson to round up the mescaleros onto that reservation. And that was terrible.
To put it lightly, yeah.
Yeah. It's called the Navajo Long Walk because they were force marched all the way from their homeland to Bosque Redondo, which is basically due east of here in Albuquerque. So they had to actually come through here in Albuquerque.
That would have been part of the walk.
Yeah, there's accounts of them coming through and just the deplorable conditions that they had to endure.
Wow.
And then it didn't get much better at Bosque Redondo. And it was a pretty badly failed reservation to the point that Congress had to send investigators to.
And what are the aspects that made it a failed reservation?
Well, there were too many people trying to farm land that was fairly marginal. There were massive crop failures. It started during the Civil War, so there was kind of a limited amount of supplies that could be sent, especially since there was no railroad through here to get them more easily sent. But there's also just the fact that this was punitive. Navajos had long been raiding and seen as a nuisance, and soldiers manning Fort Sumner, which is the fort that ran the reservation, viewed Navajos with hostility. So it was doomed to fail, and as a result, Navajos were actually in a fairly good negotiating position when when renegotiating their reservation and what reservation they have now. It was smaller at first and has expanded, but you also have to think the lands that they occupied prior to 1863, when Bosque Redondo happened, was fairly unwanted. Really, it wasn't until the uranium rush in the 1950s that
there became some interest on that land.
Yeah.
Well, I think that kind of helps paint an interesting picture then about how the specific Dene culture kind of grew and expanded in this region, and why today there is a entire nation to our west that I hope more New Mexicans and more reviewers know about that now. Let's travel a little bit now back further in history before America is part of that story. and talk about the Pueblo Revolt a little bit, because that's pretty interesting for me, because that's
A couple centuries prior, yeah.
it's a couple centuries prior. That's before the real American side had gotten here. My family was here in New Mexico at that time, and I don't know much about this time period personally of what actually triggered that conflict, and what the repercussions of it have been for the people who live in that region now. What's for our viewers, what can you tell them about the Pueblo Revolt and how that is currently affecting them?
Well, one, you have to understand that this is 17th century Spanish empire land. And at that point, Spain viewed themselves as trying to Christianize the Puebloans. Of course, there were conflicts with Utes and Apaches, Navajos. Comanches weren't really a separate group at that point. They were part of the Utes, basically. And but there was that pressure of constant raiding, but also there was this internal pressure of trying to Christianize the Puebloans, kind of eliminate their native practices, and Spain had imposed an Inquisition. Nobody expects a Spanish Inquisition.
So that started. They started looking for the Native Americans who were still practicing.
They started persecuting what they called witches, and one of those supposed witches was I'm forgetting his name. The person who led the Pueblo Revolt.
They accused him of being a witch, and that was kind of the response to this deciding of, let's go hunt down the witches of our community, make sure they're going to be Catholics, make sure they're going to...
make sure that they're not practicing these what they would have called folk religion at that point. He managed to escape punishment, though some of his friends didn't. And so he met up with a bunch of leaders in Taos and gave them these knotted ropes, saying, for each day, take a knot. And when you get to the end of that rope, revolt. And so all the Pueblos, I shouldn't say all the Pueblos, but most of the Pueblos revolted in unison. And that's a massive amount of land to try to administer, let alone suddenly the people you're trying to administer have risen up in revolt. About 500 Spaniards got killed in the revolt.
Wow. And
the entirety of New Mexico was abandoned for 12 years by the Spanish.
Wow.
And there were some Puebloans who took the side of the Spanish. For instance, Isleta mostly sided with the Spanish, and that's why down in Texas there's a place called Isleta del Sur, because that's where they ended up. They all ended up in basically the El Paso and Ciudad Juarez area. Ciudad Juarez used to be called El Paso del Norte. The Texas side was originally called Franklin. It was not settled until well later.
So you have then these kind of acts of violence that happen between the Native Americans and whatever force seems to be colonizing them at the time. And the Pueblo Americans continued to go through more hardship when America came through. And here, the schools of Carlisle that they faced in the boarding schools really did more damage on their culture there. And to this day, to talk about kind of how they have recovered, the current Pueblo Cultural Center is actually sitting on land that used to be part of the boarding school at Carlisle, that now they currently own, and are able to use that for their own events and their own culture, which I think is really cool. And I'm interested then kind of looking at where different pieces of America, whether it's my Spanish ancestors or the American Empire colonizing, is then this kind of form of protesting, this form of violence even as a response. Is that an effective way to resist that kind of colonialism? Is that something that if we see, we're lucky today we don't see violence in America over these sort of things, but whether it's the territories and like Puerto Rico or the reservations. I don't know if America can always be so confident there won't be violence. I'm curious if we ever start to see those kind of things muster in the community again. Should we be afraid of those things? And if they happen, are they actually effective methods of resistance to imperialism?
Well, when you manage to beat back the strongest empire in the world and make it stop expanding for nearly a century, I think that's pretty effective.
Yeah.
But when the Spanish came back, and I just remembered the leader of the revolt's name is Pope, and Pope ruled as kind of a king for a little bit in New Mexico, and it's not clear what happened, but somewhere in that 12 years he got overthrown and everything kind of went to chaos. And so when the Spanish came back in 1692, they were able to reestablish control fairly easily. There was a minor revolt in 1698, but that was fairly easily put down, and then Pueblo resistance basically didn't happen all the way until 1847 with the Taos Revolt. And that was against American authority. So that's, if you look at it in the long run, was it effective? That's an argument, not something you can say for sure. But also, I don't think that's something we really have to think about. Nobody's talking about, armed
rebellion. Kind
yeah.
of thing. But so you don't think Americans should ever have to kind of worry about whether or not the groups that we have control over that aren't states, that have different organizational status with the United States, you don't think that would ever be something that we could look forward to in the future of being a potential source of conflict?
Well, we certainly have seen conflict in these places over and over and over again. For instance, a funny story of in the late 1890s, like 1898, 1896, somewhere around there, the Taos sheriff was called out to supposedly put down a new Pueblo revolt, and it turned out to just be some firecrackers. But
Nice.
But there were people actually like afraid that it was happening again, and but in you mentioned Puerto Rico, for instance. Puerto Rico had an armed insurrection in the 1950s, to the point that they actually were sending insurgents towards Congress, for instance. They actually managed to get a couple of people in Congress shooting down on the floor in the 50s.
I actually didn't know that at all. That's a really recent history.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe we shouldn't be so comfortable that it can't happen, but maybe not wake in fear of it, but certainly be aware of its history, and by being acknowledging of its history, maybe we can avoid it and approach these problems a bit more civilly and peacefully.
Well, it's also a question of, does it work?
Is violence an effective form of protest?
It often isn't. The main thing that makes it work, as we saw with Pope and the Pueblo Revolt, it's not so much about the acts of violence themselves, it's about the organization. Organization legitimates violence. But
That's
without that element, you can't really do it. So if you just have a bunch of terror cells, like with the Puerto Ricans in the 1950s, it's not going to be effective.
That definitely talks about a lot of what we've been looking at too, or at least what I've been looking at on my interviews and on this channel recently. We're kind of coming to the end of our time here. If I could actually give our viewers any video recommendation of viewers, a personal favorite of mine is you break down a video from Prager University where Candace Owens gives a rather ridiculous take on
Actually wanted to take that video down.
Really, really, I love this video. So for those who don't know, Prager University is a far right video source company that makes educational videos, and Candace Owens is a commentator from the Daily Wire for those who know that conservative source, and they teamed up to make a video that breaks down the history of slavery, and it's actually rather horrendous. It's a terrible video, and recently in the United States, a few states in the South, like Texas and Florida, have actually approved their educators to show these videos to students. So now there are high schoolers now who are seeing content as horrendous as that, and being told that this is a very fair way of looking at history. It's part of their curriculum now. And what I like about you as an educator, as well as a creator, you have a due diligence about everything. You focus on being a creator to your very large channel, to the people that you know that they're going to be interested in history, but then you make sure that they have the right information. And as a cynical historian, you gave me an interesting definition of cynical to start this off. What is the definition of cynicism, and why do you call yourself the cynical historian?
Well, I call myself the cynical historian because I just like the ancient philosophy, Diogenes and that. The 5 cynical virtues, but a more modern definition I gave from Oscar Wilde, which was a cynic is a perpetually disappointed optimist.
I like that. What is it? Disappointed optimist? Is that
perpetually disappointed optimist?
Perpetually disappointed optimist.
Yeah.
And I think as a cynic myself, I can relate to that definition a lot. So I have to ask the cynical historian then: is colonialism over? That's my question for this interview.
And I don't think you can ever say it's over. We're certainly seeing a resurgence in attempts to take territory, for instance, in Ukraine and that right now. That's certainly colonialism right there, happening. It started only 2 years ago.
Actually, today is the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine,
wow.
the crossing of the border.
Yeah.
So funny you mentioned that.
But in terms of whether or not it is, if like we're still colonies here, like is New Mexico
Is Albuquerque still a colony?
Yeah. And I think that's distorting the definition of colonialism too much beyond recognition. You can certainly say that there are remnants and effects from that, because history never ends, and it's our story, and so we're all settlers. But we have been incorporated into a national body politic. That act of incorporation is the end of colonialism.
I like that, and that's a nice way to say self-determination is actually the way you beat imperialism in that regard. And it almost sounds like, at least that's how I'm going to interpret it. I like that. All right. Well, thank you for talking to me about so many different aspects of history. I could talk to you a while about a lot of things, but unfortunately our time's cut short. But I hope everyone goes and checks out your channel, The Cynical Historian, on YouTube. You do some really cool work, and then you continue to teach at UNM. For that, which we love and appreciate you for here in the community. So thank you for coming to check us out on Public Access. Take care. Thank you, guys.